Record temperatures were recorded in heatwaves across Europe this summer. Thousands of people were killed, and wildfires burned through tens of thousands of hectares of land. Global warming is melting glaciers and forcing sea levels to rise. As we go to press, 1/3 of Pakistan remains underwater. Over 750,000 livestock are dead across the country, and millions of people remain homeless and at risk of disease. Climate change, fueled by the burning of fossil fuels and to a lesser extent deforestation for agriculture, urbanization and industry, is accelerating. In July, the British oil multinational Shell plc broke its own profit record for the second consecutive quarter. Banks are continuing to funnel billions of dollars into the fossil fuel industry. The big five British banks, that's Barclays, HSBC, Lloyds, NatWest and Standard Chartered, invested $190 billion between 2018 and 2020 alone. Welcome to FRFI video. This video comes from the article Only Socialism Can Solve the Climate Crisis by Rhea Aveling from issue 290 of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, newspaper of the Revolutionary Communist Group. This article is a review of our new pamphlet on the climate crisis. Capitalism is extinction, socialism is survival. You can get a link to both the article and the pamphlets in the description below.
It's never been more evident that capitalism is not only incapable of resolving the climate crisis, but that in its inherent drive to accumulate, it can only exacerbate the crisis. Existing environmental literature has addressed capitalism as the root of global warming and environmental degradation, but this has been done by blaming climate crisis on one particular form of capitalism, such as neoliberalism, or without looking at the complete explanation, that it is capitalism in its monopoly stage, that is, in its imperialist stage, having expanded to every corner of the earth, that is driving the planet towards destruction. The result is an argument that capitalism can be reformed. Moreover, from Naomi Klein to Georges Monbiot, what you will not find in mainstream anti-capitalist environmental literature is a solid argument as to why the solution to the climate crisis is socialism. In this context, the publication of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism's pamphlet, Capitalism is Extinction, Socialism is Survival, is crucial. It sets out to prove not just how capitalist production and imperialist exploitation necessitates the destruction of the environment, but also how the only way to fight back against the extinction facing our planet is to build socialism. Scientists across the world are clear that human activity is driving global warming and environmental destruction. The burning of fossil fuels, deforestation for agriculture and industry have increased the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases trap and absorb radiation from the sun, causing the Earth's surface to warm. As it says on page 11 of the pamphlet, economic activities that the imperialist system depends upon have raised atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from 280 parts per million, or ppm, to 410 ppm over the last 150 years. Chapter 1 shows how this is the case. The section on deforestation, pages 11 to 12, is a useful example. Forests absorb carbon dioxide, and so deforestation, which is accelerating at an alarming rate, with 80 million hectares of forest destroyed since 1990, increased CO2 emissions. In 2019, human activity is estimated to have released 43 gigatons of emissions in total. And land use changes, including deforestation and forest fires, are estimated to account for 15% of that figure. Agribusiness is responsible for around 80% of deforestation. It is the unsustainable demand within the imperialist countries for beef, soybean, palm oil that is driving deforestation. There's more info on that on page 16 in the pamphlet. In just 50 years, 17% of the Amazon rainforest, home to millions of people, plants, animals and insects, has been destroyed. This has been increased rapidly under the former Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro, backed by British and US imperialism, whose corporations stand to benefit from the selling off of Brazil's land and resources. Successive climate change conferences, attended by world leaders, have failed to achieve anything of substance. Chapter 2 takes us through the succession of failures, from the UN Climate Conference in Rio in 1992 to COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And while making this video, the next issue of FRFI, issue 291, came out. In it we add COP27 to the list of failed climate conferences. It represents the death of 1.5°C, a limit of global temperature rises agreed at COP26 that brings us too close to more ecologically devastating tipping points. And we explain how this loss and damages fund that's being praised by climate moderates is nowhere near sufficient, or anywhere near as progressive as they might make it seem. Check out the article for more information. It's well worth the read, and it's linked in the description below. The point of such conferences is to maintain the interests of imperialist powers by putting up the appearance of taking action, while in reality making empty promises that include no mechanisms for being held to account. As we say on page 27 of the pamphlet, at conferences from Rio to Glasgow, the strongest lobby is that of capital, the giant monopolies and the imperialist governments that represent them.
How these giant monopolies and imperialist governments operate and where they came from is explored in chapter 3. With concision but illustrated with reference to literature and poetry, the pamphlet takes us through the history of capitalism. It shows how capitalist production necessarily developed into a global system of imperialism in which a handful of advanced capitalist countries maintained their wealth through the looting and plunder of the rest of the world. While now almost all formally independent, the underdeveloped countries are still controlled by the imperialist countries through forms of financial control. One such form of financial control is via monopoly companies and banks hosted in imperialist countries. World production is dominated by mining and other extractive industries, as well as agribusiness. The City of London plays a central role in managing the flows of capital for some of the largest oil and mining multinationals. Their activities emit vast quantities of greenhouse gases, pollute water, air and land, and displace whole communities, turning some into wage workers on minimum wage and driving others to become stateless migrants. These companies include the British-owned company Anglo-American, the Anglo-Swiss company Glencore, Anglo-Australian company BHP Billiton, and the British-owned Shell. Examples of their exploitation of people and the planet in their drive for profit are found in the pamphlet. Another such form of financial control is via international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. For centuries, underdeveloped countries have had their wealth, land and resources stolen. Many are financially impoverished and dependent on loans from institutions like the IMF, controlled by imperialist countries. Such loans come with structural reform agreements that require privatization of resources, allowing imperialist multinationals to swoop in and buy the control of the resources for well under their value. In the Sahel region in West Africa, famines have been linked to the agriculturally destructive character of the reform programs forced through by the IMF. Another such form of control is via the imposition of unpayable debt on the developing world. The interest rates on the loans from the likes of the IMF and the World Bank lock countries into paying back their loans again and again, keeping them impoverished and dependent on imperialist countries.
Under capitalist production, corporations have no choice but to continue expanding in the insatiable drive for profit. In doing so, oil and gas corporations will burn more fossil fuels and release more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Agribusiness corporations will have to clear more land, destroying biodiversity and forests in the process. Seeking ever greater returns, the technologies employed by the multinationals to increase yields are wreaking havoc on the environment. Monoculture, genetically modified production, and artificial selection are causing a loss of genetic diversity and ecosystem dysfunction. Intensive agriculture is bringing humans into contact with ever greater numbers of pathogens, increasing the likelihood of pandemics. This link between economic growth and environmental degradation is acknowledged by climate activist groups. However, in defence of their own class interests, many advocate for a reformed capitalism, some advancing fantasies of degrowth. Under capitalism, degrowth means recession. In reality, this means poverty, austerity, and war. As the former chief of green investment at the investment multinational BlackRock, Tariq Fancy, admits, business does not have this capacity to grow sustainably. It is not because they are evil, it is because the system is built to extract profits. Other arguments for environmental reform under capitalism include various types of Green New Deals that advocate investment in so-called clean energy technologies. The rare minerals and metals necessary for the electric cars and wind turbines to power these Green New Deals would need to be ripped out of the ground with destructive methods, and the resources looted from the underdeveloped countries to which they belong. Moreover, for Britain alone to make all vehicle sales battery electric by 2035 and to replace all cars and vans, excluding HGVs, with electric vehicles by 2050, it would need almost twice the total annual world cobalt production, 3/4 of the world's lithium production, and almost 10% of the world's copper production. Having proven that monopoly capitalism is incapable of resolving the climate crisis, and indeed can only accelerate it, the final parts of the pamphlet look at resistance in Britain and then at socialism as the only viable alternative. In Britain, there is a history of direct action to halt environmentally destructive projects, such as through trespass and occupations, and a need for this trend to develop into a broad-based, sustained movement. In 2019, we saw the emergence of various climate action groups, such as You Strike for Climate. Chapter 5 looks at how these groups brought the struggle forward, as well as assessing their limitations that resulted in their gradual decline, and lessons to learn going forward. The chapter also looks at some of the actions Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism helped to organise, through involvement in a distinctly anti-imperialist trend within the climate struggle. Working with Earthstrike Merseyside, there were regular rolling pickets on high street multinationals and banks, and occupations of a branch of HSBC. Participation in Earthstrike north of the river resulted in demonstrations outside the head offices of Glencore, Rio Tinto, Unilever, BlackRock and Anglo American. The final chapter shows that only under a socialist system is there any hope that humanity can avoid planetary catastrophe. The environmental achievements of the Soviet Union are documented before looking at the example of socialist Cuba today. In rejecting the need for socialist production, centrally planned production for the use of a profit, as the only alternative to capitalist environmental destruction, mainstream anti-capitalist writers refuse to acknowledge Cuba.
Today, one of the only countries in the world to be developing sustainably and with environmental protection enshrined in its constitution, Cuba stands to show what is possible under a socialist system. It's not always been a world leader in sustainability. While under imperialist domination, the environment was degraded by chronic deforestation and soil erosion. But after the 1959 revolution, the people came to realize the totality of production relations meant that an environmental agenda could not be separated from the rest of the political, economic framework. While contributing very little towards global emissions, as a small island nation in the Caribbean, Cuba is disproportionately feeling the effects of climate change. Socialist Cuba is responding by putting humanity first. It has a 100-year plan to protect the island and its population from the effects of global warming, including rising sea levels threatening coastal communities. The Cuban state is working with those communities to look for alternative locations, taking into consideration the jobs and customs of the inhabitants. Orlando Ray, Cuba's lead negotiator at COP26, is unequivocal that the extinction facing humanity can only be resolved through structural changes. A change in the way of life, in our aspirations. It requires a vision not directed towards profit or self-interest. It must be premised on social equity and rejecting inequity. A plan of this nature requires a different social system, and that is socialism. The fight against global warming and climate change can seem an impossible task without a framework to understand and direct the struggle that has to take place. Capitalism is extinction, socialism is survival is clear on that direction. Rationalizing production to replace capitalist consumerism will provide the socialist solution to an equitable future where the Earth's natural resources are respected as part of the equation of production and nurtured for future generations. Such a future, however, has to be fought for, and it's fitting that the pamphlet ends with a call to action, to join Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism on the streets, to fight for the environment and to fight for the future.
You can get more from FRFI by visiting the link to our website in the description below. Not just more articles, news and analysis, but also more of the change you want to see in the world. You can inquire about joining our FRFI supporters groups, public meetings, and much more. Subscribing to our newspaper also helps support the work that we do, as does getting a copy of our pamphlets or any of our other publications. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the struggle.